Phenomenology of Spirit 2 GB for Hegel. 125 Thinking. Again I came across philosophizing about spirit. Thesis, Hegel's, is it? The first level of consciousness is a state in which the spirit still seems to be dreaming. Man does not yet know anything exactly about himself. This is shown approximately in the self-awareness of a small child. It has nothing but a dull feeling that it is there. Antithesis, his again, on the second level. He, man, notices himself, begins to discover himself. In self-observation, alienation in I appears. It separates into the observing self. And on the self that is the object of observation. That's good of him. Synthesis. In the third degree, man discovers the following. What I observe in self-observation is myself. The observer and the observed are one and the same I. The result of this thinking is, the human spirit is self-awareness. This self-awareness is developing, and as such, is dialectical. Well, I say, so far so true, and let's see what I did afterwards. If this is dialectic above, then the following is the conclusion. That is, based on observation, logic, and logic is older than humming. It is important to a hungry child whether the plate with food is already on the table, dative, or will be placed on the table, accusative. Just because in the first case it is closer to the goal, to fill the stomach. Otherwise, the dative and accusative have never even been thought of. Because he doesn't even have knowledge yet, with which it would have the ability to think about them. A child is only capable of playing and eating. And man is man. When he is able to understand the dative and accusative, then he is capable of understanding the observer and the observed in oneself. In thesis and antithesis, the philosopher operates with help of two subjects, one of which observes and the other does not observe. A child and a man are inability and ability. Immediately after that, two objects exist. A child, who feels himself as a whole simple being, and man, who follows the processes in his mind. And in the end, it all boils down to stretching, which is nothing more than the mystification of the intellectual development of the human individual. A stretch that the abilities of a healthy human individual to acquire knowledge on the basis of a powerful brain gives a name, spirit. And so I meet it everywhere, priests, masters of what? Philosophers, writers, poets, mention only. From God the Spirit and eternal soul in man. Still knitting, without a single meaningful word about the definition and identification of spirit and soul. What those two undefined and unidentified can do and what they do. It is true, as Hegel said, that there is an observer and the observed. However, the one who is the observed and the observer, one and the same, is sometimes aware that the observer is not observing the worker in him, and sometimes he is not aware of it. I said that in the brain, as a worker, which is also a workshop on 4 levels, the 6th action on the 3rd level of the workshop is the observer of the worker. It means the supervisor, the director of the observer and the observed. And that is not difficult to discover, because it is a simple matter of logic. At the 4th level of the brain as a workshop is the 7th action of the brain as a worker. That action is actually a state, active duration of inactivity. Raise the mind with it above the worker, above the observer of the worker and above the observer of the worker. In the mind, with the mind, mentally, find yourself outside the mind. In the mind, not by opiates or trance, not mindlessly by chemistry or hypnosis, to be aware of yourself only as a subject who does nothing. Absolute non-action in absolute awareness of yourself as the position of the absolute. So, not the I that is only in a small child, that is aware of itself in its material environment, but the I that is aware of itself as the position of God. So, there is no I am or I want to drink, to eat, or to do whatever. Just I. Awareness equals bliss. So, it is the state of the absolute in a man, that is, a man in the absolute. So there is no spirit for Hegel's stratification into the scheme of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Well, now, in the spirituality of the absolute, which Hegel explains with a parallel between the spirituality of a mature man and the still immature absolute, Hegel puts forward the thesis that the absolute manifests itself through the creation of the material world. However, unlike the child's first awareness, which is a spontaneous realization of oneself as a dull self, Hegel's antithesis is that the absolute seeks itself purposefully. In what? Even though it doesn't know itself, just like that child who doesn't know anything about itself. For Hegel's antithesis, Hegel's absolute seeks itself in the world which it created. To whom? How does an immature absolute know where to look? So the absolute is then sought itself in the spirit of Hegel's mature, synthesized man, in the spirit of that man who knows only about the worker and the observer of the worker in himself. Therefore, the absolute is not sought itself in the spirit of a child, which is not aware of itself, but in the spirit of a man, which Hegel only partially understood. And where does the absolute find itself? In the works of one of its own manifestation, in the works of Hegel's mature man. Specifically, says Hegel, in the concept of statehood, the inauguration of the state, the establishment of law, philosophy, religion, how could it be other than in Christian history and, as he claimed in his Aesthetics, the highest of all arts, that is, the closest to the absolute, poetry. Which is a special nonsense from Hegel. Essentially through education of a society, through institutions, through useful and useless knowledge, becomes the spirit of the world and the spirit of the absolute. Of course through the German S. That is Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, which is one nonsense. Because what I said, that the awareness of oneself as the position of God is at the fourth level of brain activity, that is, above the supervisor, above the observer of the worker and the worker himself, has nothing to do with the intellectual scope of humanity or man as a general being, because the awareness of oneself as the position of God is a condition that does not require any kind of education system at all, but it is enough to raise the mind to position number 4, only the mind aware of itself as a whole without any activity. Now, what education, culture and morality bring to people as a species is another matter. God, as the absolute, is indifferent to the cultural reach of any group of people. Morality as an influence on the genetic code of individuals is in the interest of the human species. And it is unimportant to God, because he starts from spontaneity and has no plan to fall into nature, nor to set the goal of gaining self-awareness, being unaware of himself. All this happens inevitably, as the child's self-awareness as an observer participant and synthesis into a single half-I appears. Well, if the mind at all rises to the third and fourth stages of the action of the mind, which is actually the working ability of the brain. Hegel did not finish the job completely, and only because he devalued Chinese and Indian philosophy. Because Hegel believed that there was nothing to learn from them. Because he considered mysticism the mental technique with which Chinese and Indian sages excluded themselves mentally from the material world. And even if he understood what was going on there, he would have kept quiet. Hegel was such a man. As in his 3-volume History of Philosophy, for example, he did not mention Nicolaus Cusanus in a single word. And so, this is about the famous phenomenology of spirit, which is actually nothing.